you all pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O God, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. When we see a story mentioned across all four Gospels, that is a cue for us to sit up and pay attention. As modern Christians, we tend to think of the story of Jesus, starting at birth, ending sometime around the Ascension, but really there are these four stories from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And like any four people telling the same story, we get what they think is the most important part. The Last Supper is one of those few stories that is mentioned across all four Gospels. It gets a longer treatment in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but Jesus eating with his disciples on the night of his betrayal is found across all four. And this story is familiar to us. We tell it every week here. Jesus with the bread and the cup telling his disciples to remember him. This story is familiar because we do what Jesus commanded us to. We remember him and that Last Supper every time we have Holy Communion. In order for us to truly follow what Jesus did at this table, we need to pay attention to who was there. Jesus offered this meal to his disciples, including Judas Iscariot. Judas would go immediately after that dinner to betray Jesus to the authorities, and a detail that we get across all four Gospels is that Jesus knew that. Jesus knew that when he shared a meal with his disciples, that Judas had already made up his mind to hand him over to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver. He knew that Judas would eat and run, that Judas was in the middle of setting in motion the circumstances that would lead to Jesus' death. And Jesus fed him. He told Judas that this bread and the cup were his own body broken for him. He nourished Judas's body by giving him something to eat and drink, and he showed us that grace has been at the center of this meal since its institution 2 millennia ago. I mentioned earlier that John's account of the Last Supper is less detailed. In it, he still writes about the meal, but instead of Jesus' grace being centrally located in the bread and the cup, John writes about the foot washing that happens right before the meal. Jesus washes his disciples' feet, all of them, even Judas. Just as Jesus cares for his disciples through a meal, we see him caring for their bodies and souls through this ritual act too. There's a Catholic artist in Australia called Salt and Gold who has recently gone viral for her artwork called the Foot Washing series. In it, she depicts Jesus washing lots of people who we would recognize from the church: Eve, Mary, the Pope, St. Francis. She also draws Jesus washing the feet of some other kinds of people: an incarcerated man, a person draped in a pride flag, a healthcare worker with lines on her face from her goggles. And her message is clear. God's grace extends to all people. Jesus' action of washing feet is proof and example of that. Now, the open communion table is one of my most beloved traditions as a Christian, so this illustration series of foot washing was right up my alley. I read the scriptures and I see Jesus eating with everyone, washing every disciple's feet, and I know that I'm called to extend that same grace to everyone, starting with communion. But in February, this artist posted 2 new foot washing prints that turned my stomach. The first was tragic but stirring. Jesus washing the feet of a Ukrainian refugee, a woman holding a small child draped in their national flag. As Jesus washed the feet of the refugees, you could see his tears falling into the basin. This was a poignant depiction of the horrors of war and the helplessness of those fleeing their country. But the next print was Jesus, still weeping, washing the feet of Vladimir Putin. And I felt my heart harden when I saw this image. I was disgusted. I wanted to find the words that I could send to this artist to tell her how wrong she was for posting this. I pictured the refugees fleeing, the terror sweeping across Europe, the tension in these rooms where decisions are being made. And I thought about this man who is so bent on legacy and power that human life is just a barrier to him getting what he wants. And when I clicked through these pictures, I saw something that continued to send me spinning. This artist sells her prints from the foot washing series, and you can usually get several or just one, but for these two, you could only buy them together. There was no getting the image of the Ukrainian refugee without Putin. These images, and that choice to pair them together, have been on my mind since I've seen them. And I wish that I had a beautiful, meaningful, theologically sound way to wrap up my thoughts in a bow for you all, and I'll tell you now that I do not. But I know a few things about Jesus and about God. I know that Jesus did not suffer fools. He did not excuse the actions of people who harmed others. Jesus was against empire because empire is a bloodthirsty machine. I also know that Jesus is present in our bread and our cup, just as God was present for the Last Supper and the washing of the disciples' feet. God's grace is available to us at this table, and we extend that grace to all who come to eat and drink. Jesus knew that there were sinners among those he washed and fed that night. Not just sinners, one who would betray him, one who would deny him, and all who would abandon him in his hour of greatest need. And he washed them anyway, and he fed them anyway. I'll admit to you now that I don't know how to do these things in remembrance of Jesus when I am confronted with war. I don't know how grace works when reproductive rights are dissolving before my eyes. I don't know how to extend God's love to people who wish to harm queer youth. I don't know what I would do if they came to this table and asked for a meal of God's grace. But I know what Jesus would do. I know because that is the story that we get across all four Gospels. A royal flush of stories that come down to God's grace. Jesus gave the gift of grace to everyone who came to him and asked to receive it. And I know that Jesus is present when we set this table. And we have a benefit that Judas did not in Jesus' story. We can allow this table to change us. If we receive a meal of grace, even knowing that there is nothing that we can do to earn it, we can change. When we offer a meal of grace to someone who thinks surely they will be turned away, it can change them. When we participate in a ritual that requires our humility in remembrance of Jesus, we let grace do its thing on us and on others. This isn't a bow to tie it all up, because this world is messy. When it comes down to it, God's grace is not just for some, and we cannot step in to be the arbiters of that grace. We cannot force someone to be changed through offering the bread and cup, but we offer it nonetheless, because Jesus showed us how to, and because that is how we can do these things in remembrance of him. Let us receive grace and let us offer it. Let it be so. Amen.